Welcome back, everyone. Today we're making a kitty landing pad sweatshirt. This is a super random design. It actually comes from the idea that cats like to sit in squares. So I thought, heck, why not put a square on a sweatshirt and see what happens? So we'll be splitting this video up. The first section is gonna be the actual step-by-step making of it. In the second section is gonna be testing. And I'm gonna be using the raglan sweatshirt pattern. I'll put a link down in the description for the pattern and the video. I already made this video before, the detailed steps, the machines, the fabric, everything you need to know to make this sweatshirt. And what we're gonna be doing is chopping up that midsection to create a square. So realistically, you can use any pattern out there. But other than that, let's get started. So we're gonna start by actually making the sweatshirt. Getting started with the supplies you'll need 1.5 to 2 yards for your main fabric. And I recommend using fleece, sweatshirt fleece, Sherpa, any type of stretchy fabric will work. I'm gonna be using a mixture of sweatshirt fleece and Sherpa. I'll be using the sweatshirt fleece for the main portion and then Sherpa for just the square. And when it comes to the square, realistically, you can use any type of fabric you want, but you really want to make sure it has a little bit of stretch. You'll need 1/4 yard of rib knit fabric, and this is going to be used for the neckline, the cuffs, and the waistband. The pattern we're going to be using is the raglan pattern. I made a full video on this pattern, the assembly, the fabrics, the machines. This video is a little bit more experimental. I'm showing you what you can do with pre-existing patterns. Whether it's using the pattern I made or any other pattern, you can do the same thing. All you need is that base foundation pattern to work with. Once you decided on the pattern you're gonna use and you have all your supplies, the next step is gonna be cutting up the pattern. So what we're gonna do first is lay our pattern out flat and start drawing where we want the square to be. And I'm gonna be drawing a line from the bottom arm to the center. Since you can't just cut a square out of the center and sew it back in super easy, what we're gonna be doing is creating 2 lines, cutting out that strip, and then cutting a square from that strip. And the area I'm shading is the area that I potentially want my square to be, but until I get that strip cut out, I can't really fully know if it's gonna work exactly. So if you are using the raglan pattern, I don't necessarily recommend copying exactly what I'm doing because I'm using a different size, the length might be different. There's a lot of little factors that can come into play and really change the square size. And don't worry, you can always tape the pattern back together and cut it again to make sure you get that perfect square. And as you can see, the center block is where the square is going to be. From here, we're going to do the same exact thing to the opposite panel, and this is going to be my back body panel. I'll be adding the squares on both of these panels, so I'm going to do the same exact thing to the back body panel. If you're only adding the square on the front body panel, then you would leave the back panel alone. And the biggest concern here is just matching it exactly to the front, so that way the strips line up when you sew the side seams. For the arm panel, you really don't have to do anything. I'm just gonna add a 2-tone, so I'm gonna cut it directly down the center. And this will give me the option to use 2 different fabrics. And the only purpose for doing this is look. After cutting the panel and cutting out your fabric, you're gonna wanna end up with 2 side strips, 1 center strip cut on the fold, 1 bottom strip cut on the fold, and lastly 2 top strips cut on the fold. And if you're gonna be doing the same thing for the back body panel, you'll want all of the same panels. And moving on to the arm panels, you're going to want 2 of the bottom strips and 2 of the top strips. Moving on to assembly, grab your back or front body panel. What we're going to do first is sew together that center strip. So grab the square and the 2 side panels, place the right sides together, lining the panels up on both sides of the square and sew at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm using a serger on this project. If you don't have a serger, I recommend using a zigzag stitch. From here, we're gonna open up the panels, fold the seam allowance towards the outside, and add a top stitch. Feel free to skip the top stitching. I just want the edges of the square to be defined, and top stitching really brings that out. After finishing the top stitching, we're gonna just check to see if that square is actually looking like a square. If it does look like a square, we're gonna move on and add the top strip. Unfold the section, lay it on the top edge of the square. Find the centers of both of these panels, place the right sides together. Lastly, grab the bottom strip and we're gonna do the same exact thing. Unfold it and line it up on the bottom edge of the square with right sides together. From here, we're gonna stitch both sections at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I do recommend placing a few pins so everything stays lined up as you're sewing it. It will overall make the project go a lot smoother and faster. After serging, we're gonna unfold just the bottom strip. Fold the seam allowance towards the bottom panel and add a top stitch. And we're going to do the same thing for the top section. Fold the seam allowance towards the top panel away from that center square and add a top stitch. If you are on the fence about adding top stitching, I recommend just skipping ahead to see what it looks like, because I really think it brings out that square and makes it look really nice. I definitely think it's worth the extra time put into it. After completing the top stitch, this is going to complete the body panel. As you can see, we have our Sherpa square with the sweatshirt fleece around the outside. Pretty much everything we're looking to make and intriguing for a cat. And if you're choosing to do the same thing for the opposite body panel, we're going to assemble it with the same steps. So there's no need to repeat this entire process, just jump back and rewatch the video if you need to watch the steps again. Moving on to the arm panels, since I did make these two-tone, I'm going to have to sew them back together. So lay the top section out with right sides facing up. Find the middle edge for both of the panels. With the middle edges located, we're going to line them up directly on the center with right sides together. Place a few pins and stitch both edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like the body panels, we will be adding top stitching. Fold the arm panel flat, find the seam allowance, and you can point the seam allowance in any direction on the arms. I'll be pointing mine towards the top of the panel and stitching on the white fabric. It really comes down to personal preference, so you may want to play around with it before you decide which side to top stitch. With the arms complete, we can place them off to the side and grab our front body panel. Locate both of the arm edges, grab your arm panels, and do the same thing. Find the front edge to match. And an easy way to do this is using the pattern to find out what edge lines up with what body panel. Once you have that figured out, we're going to line the edges up, right sides together, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And always double check before you start sewing, because it's very easy to mix these panels up. Open up all the panels so the right sides are facing up. Locate the seam allowance, and we're going to be pointing ours in towards the front body panel. So roll that seam allowance towards the body and add your top stitch. And another thing to keep in mind, this adds a little bit of strength in the shoulder area. Open the panels back up with right sides facing up. Find the opposite edges of the arm panel that connect to the body and place this panel off to the side. Grab the back body panel, locate the arm edges, and line those edges up with the edges on your arm panels. Make sure you have the right sides together, and we're going to add a stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. At this point, you can start to see the actual formation of the sweatshirt. Before we sew the side seams, we're going to quickly finish off our top stitch, so we're going to fold that seam allowance towards the back panel and add the top stitch. And sorry if this video is going kind of fast, I already made this sweatshirt before in a separate video, so if you want to see more in depth on the actual assembly, I recommend checking out that video linked below. But that's going to finish our body and arm assembly. From here, we're going to flip the right sides together, lining up both of the side seams. An easy way to do this is to line up the bottom strips, the top strips, and even the armpit area. Place pins at each one of these points, move over to the opposite side, and do the same exact thing. When you have both of the side seams lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I definitely recommend taking your time to make sure each one of those points lines up as you're sewing, because once you get it unfolded, it's going to look a lot nicer when everything lines up all the way around the sweatshirt. After finishing up the side seams, the last thing we're going to do is add a top stitch. So open up that sweatshirt, fold the seam allowance towards the back or the front. It really doesn't matter. It's only based on look. Since I'm using two different color fabrics, I'm going to be jumping that section and doing just the gray first. Starting at the bottom and working my way up towards that sleeve. Once I get to the top, I'm going to start on the inside of the sleeve opening and move out towards the outside. And lastly, I'm going to go back and stitch that section of white. This is by far not the quickest way to do it, but it's a way to get the color thread to match the color fabric you're using. Most companies will use one color all the way through that side seam. From here, you can place the panel off to the side and grab our cuff panels. These panels are all going to be assembled the same way, and you can change the actual width, height, everything on these to customize it to your fit. Starting with the waistband panel, place the right sides together. Repeat this process for the neckline and the cuff panels. With the right sides together, we're going to stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I find it works best to use a straight stitch on rib knit fabrics when you're sewing in the opposite direction of the stretch. By adding the stitch, we're going to complete the full loop, and we can add these onto our sweatshirt. I like to get the biggest one out of the way first, so grab the waistband panel, place the wrong sides together so you have a nice clean bottom edge. Find the bottom assembly, move towards the bottom edge. As you can notice, the waistband panel is smaller than the width of the body panel. This is because it stretches to fit that edge. So flip the wrong sides out, line the raw edges of the waistband panel up with the raw edges of the bottom edge. To keep the waistband panel center, we're going to line the side seams up with the side seams of the body panel. Stretch it to the circumference of the body panel, add a few pins, and stitch the entire outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the best way to add rib knit fabric is to pull the rib knit as you're sewing it so it matches the outside circumference of your body panel. It does take a little getting used to and some practice. And as you can see, the waistband pulls back, so adjusting this will make a big difference in the fit. The last step is adding your top stitching. You're going to want to move your seam allowance in the opposite direction of the ribbing and add your top stitch. I really like adding the top stitching on the cuffed areas, but it is optional. From here, we're going to move up towards the arm openings. Grab both of your cuff panels, place the wrong sides together, line up your side seams, and we're going to essentially install it the same exact way we did the waistband panel. Line up the bottom raw edges and stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is a smaller opening, so you want to take your time and make sure you don't stitch multiple layers together. The last step for the cuffs is to add your top stitching, so fold the seam allowance away from the ribbing and add your stitch. Repeat this process for both of your sleeve cuffs and you're almost done with your sweatshirt. The last thing we have to do is add our neckline, so work your way towards the top neck opening. Fold the neckline in half with wrong sides together, locate the seam on the neckline, and we're going to line that up with the seam on the back body panel. This keeps both of those seams on the back side of the sweatshirt. Add a few pins and stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you are adding pins and you're using a serger, just make sure you take those pins out so you don't serge over them. The neckline can be a little tricky since it's a thinner piece of fabric, so just take your time. Once you finish stitching it on, the final thing to do is add your top stitch, so fold that seam allowance away from the ribbing and add your stitch. That's going to complete your kitty pad sweatshirt. From here, you can flip the right sides out, give it a once over, make sure all the seams are sewed together and it's looking good. And once again, if you do want to learn how to adjust this pattern to make it fit you perfectly and change the cuffs and everything like that, check out the video I have linked below. I go way more in depth on the machines and everything about fine-tuning this pattern to your liking. And that's going to do it for the assembly portion of this video, but before we move on, I want to quickly add some embroidery. I had to make it more official and add a kitty helicopter landing pad, just so Dakota knows where to land when she's flying up to that sweatshirt. So now that we have all the embroidery on the sweatshirt, it's time to move into testing. For the first test, I'm just going to put it on the ground and see what Dakota does, see if she likes it, if she's intrigued by it. The whole design lies within the idea that cats like to sit in squares, so hopefully the square is square enough for Dakota to see and want to sit in. But right off the bat, she is intrigued by the sweatshirt. She does like to lay on things on the ground, so that might not be that big of a deal. She did fairly quickly move up into the square, so that is a pretty good sign that it might actually work. I pretty much just let the sweatshirt sit there for a while and filmed it while she would mess around with it, come up to it, walk in and out of it. But finally, she laid down in the square, kind of on the landing pad. So overall, for the first test, I'm going to count it as a win. It overall caught her eye and she went and sat within the square. There was even a little interest within Udon to go check it out. He does have a blanket with this material, so he might think it's his blanket. But in the end, he didn't really care, so I don't think it's going to be a good call for dogs. For the final test, I'm going to throw it on and lay on the couch and see what Dakota does, see if she wants to actually sit within the square. But again, this test doesn't really mean anything because Dakota always likes to sit on you when you sit on the couch, so it could go either way. Right off the bat, she jumped up, sat within the square, and just chilled there. And these aren't really scientific tests, this is just trying it on. I have no control group or anything like that, so feel free to run your own testing and comment down below. I personally think this is just a fun idea for a sweatshirt, so I highly recommend making one for yourself or a friend. And it's not only a fun thing to make, it's also a good way to see how you can change these patterns and really make them into your own design. And again, you can do this with any type of pattern, whether it's just a standard crew neck or a raglan. You can chop up that pattern, add different shapes, designs, different fabrics. There's really so much you can do, which is a basic foundation pattern. If yours turned out super cool, definitely tag me on Instagram. I would love to see it. But other than that, thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. And I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.